We're delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr Amy Blakeway, Senior Lecturer at the University of St Andrews. Amy's talk this evening, Her Father's Daughter, How Mary Queen of Scots Governed, takes us away from the romantic image of Mary. It will reveal instead how her governing regime used precedents set by her father, the canny and assertive James V, to govern Scotland. During the course of her talk, Amy will examine some of NRS's treasures, including Parliamentary and Privy Council records, as well as a wide range of sources from Scottish and foreign archives. Over to you, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tessa, and also Jocelyn. And thank you, everybody, for joining. For those of you in the central belt of Scotland, I can see friends from Linlithgow and Bowness and people up in Dunfermline. Thank you especially because I think you're missing out on a glass of something cool and refreshing in the sunshine. Perhaps the people joining us from Norfolk, Exeter, California and Florida or Italy, hello Tracy, you'll be less sort of concerned about the sunshine. But here for us, it's a novelty. So I appreciate you skipping out on it to join me. On the other hand, Mary Queen of Scots and James V. That's a pretty exciting double bill, and I hope it will be worth your while. I'm going to start this evening's talk by taking the moment where Mary Queen of Scots was perhaps at the peak of her success. This is the moment of the birth of her son, an important moment in any parent's life, but particularly important for a queen. And the quotation we've got up on our slide, obviously that's a little portrait of James sort of a few years after he was born, is from one of Mary's great supporters, Sir James Melville of Hal Hill, the diplomat. And this describes the reaction in the English court to the news of Mary having successfully given birth to Prince James. As soon as the secretary, so this is Elizabeth I's closest advisor, whispered in her ear the news of the prince, the future James VI's birth, all merriness was laid aside for the night. Everybody there, all present, marvelling what might have, sorry, that the message has just popped up over as I was reading that quotation, what might have moved so suddenly, so sudden a change. For the Queen did sit down with her hand upon her cheek, bursting out to some of her ladies that the Queen of Scots was lighter of a fair son, while she, Elizabeth, was but a barren stock. This moment really kind of encapsulates, I think, the diplomatic relationship between Mary and Elizabeth, which a lot of popular history has really emphasised. Mary, at this moment, the successful married queen with an heir, Elizabeth, famously, who never married, never produced an heir, and never gave her kingdom that security. And the celebrations for James's birth reflected this. I mean, this was a week-long baptism programme, practically. We had fireworks, the first time that this was such a big, the ceremony of this scale in the British Isles, a real sort of Renaissance festival. It's been described as Mary's personal triumph, a tax of £12,000 raised to support this baptism. And we also see the success that Mary enjoyed here in her correspondence with Elizabeth. This is a letter written shortly after the prince's birth, in which Mary's really asserting herself over Elizabeth, showing the extent to which the prince's birth has given her new power. She's pushing here for the English succession. One of the things that Mary very famously was concerned with was her place in the English succession, her descent via her father, James V, from Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, in his eldest daughter, Margaret, James's father, Mary's grandfather. And in this letter, we see this really assertive monarch pushing her position in the birth of her heir, saying to Elizabeth that she doubts not, but in time convenient, you will proceed to perfect and consume what you've begun to utter. So you're going to make sure you do well with your promises to give us the succession. Now, I'm starting here for a number of reasons, because in a way, this letter and the birth of James tells us some of the things that we've already known about Mary, that are very popularly known, but also some things that are perhaps surprising. The relationship with Elizabeth, which is extremely important. The importance of her relationship with her husband and with her heir, James VI. but also some things that are perhaps a little bit more surprising if you think about the popular romantic image of the Queen. This letter is, of course, written in Scots, and we tend to think of Mary as being primarily politically French, but here we're actually seeing her working in Scots as part of a government in Scotland. And we're also seeing her as a very uniting figure, a strong political figure, someone who's able to work effectively in the realm of diplomacy. But this also presents us with a paradox, because a few months after this letter was written, Mary was deposed. She lost her throne. She was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle and forced to sign letters of abdication. Now, how we got there is a totally different story. Instead, we're going to ask a different question that emerges from this. Why did Mary govern the way she did? Not how did we get to Lochleven and her deposition, but how did we get here, this powerful monarch celebrating the birth of her heir and writing to her rival cousin and neighbour in such an assertive manner, enjoying the support of the wider Scottish political elite. But perhaps it's worth taking a moment to explain this comparison between Mary and her father, because it's not the ones we think about when we think about Mary. Sometimes we think about comparing Mary to Elizabeth, and I've already talked about Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen. On this slide, we've got Elizabeth's coronation portrait celebrating her virginity. You can see that with her long hair. And I say it's the coronation portrait, her loose hair rather. This wasn't painted at the time of the coronation, and we don't really know how she had her hair at the coronation. It was painted later. So it's this image of Gloriana coming through. And on the other hand, you've got one of the placards produced in the context of Mary's deposition. So this was produced shortly before she actually lost her crown. She's being portrayed as a mermaid, a symbol which has much less pleasant connotations than it does in the modern world of sort of Hans Christian Andersen and Disney, Little Mermaid, sort of quite a voracious woman, a woman who is a threat to men. And we're seeing that here in this placard produced to critique her just before her deposition. So the Elizabeth and Mary comparison is one that a lot of historians have frequently made, but I can see why. They're both women. It was quite unusual to have female rulers, and they're ruling at the same time, but it's not a particularly sound historical comparison, because if we think about how Mary's subjects, the people who really mattered in all of this, reacted to Mary, none of them had been at the English court. They didn't really know Elizabeth or how things were done there. So this is not a comparison that would have been particularly evident to them. It's one we can make with the benefit of hindsight. So, okay, when we're thinking about how Mary governed, how she actually ruled, the comparison with England isn't particularly helpful. What then about France? Mary was brought up in France. She went there in 1548, aged very, very young, aged 5 or 6, and she arrived in France betrothed to the future king, the Dauphin Francis II. And we see her here in her coronation portrait with Francis and one of the coins minted celebrating their union. And it's clear Mary did get her political education in France. This is where she was brought up. She was very familiar with French political systems, and she knew people at the French court really well. It's also a comparison her subjects would have been able to make. Many of them were educated in France. It's a place that the Scots would have been part of their consciousness to a large degree. And so, yeah, she probably did get a little bit of influence in terms of how she governed, or possibly a lot of influence from France. But if we're thinking about how Mary ruled, how she acted as queen, the most obvious comparison is the one which is least made. And that's with her father, King James V, who reigned from 1513, following his father James IV's deaths at Flodden, until 1542. Now, I know for a fact that James V is someone who is not as well known as I think that he ought to be. So let me introduce this monarch to you a little bit. Like his daughter, James came to the throne as a young child, not as young as Mary, who was 6 days old. He came to the throne at about 18 months, and this meant that the first 18 years really of Mary's rule, first sort of 15 years of James V was a royal minority, a period where a governor or a regent was ruling on their behalf. So both father and daughter had to come to the throne as adults and reasserting themselves following a period where there'd been a gap in the royal line. And James had a lot of similar interests to those that the court of his daughter was famous for. This is what was known as a Renaissance court. There's a huge amount of patronage of the arts, a huge amount of poetry produced in the court, plays, indications and descriptions in ambassadorial reports of these fantastic courtly ceremonies where the king is performing in chivalric pursuits, he's entertaining ambassadors. He's somebody who has a great love of travel. He went himself to France for 9 months in order to finalise his marriage negotiations and bring home his bride. So he's someone who's pushing on an international stage, someone who's really aware of Scotland's place in Europe and trying very hard to assert it effectively. He doesn't only go to France. I know there's someone here this evening from Orkney. You will be pleased to know that James V himself also visited Orkney on a famous voyage round the Isles, part of an attempt to assert control of what he regarded as the peripheries of the kingdom, to impose royal majesty and royal Stuart authority throughout the realm. We've got fantastic sources from James V's reign. This is the reign where the Court of Session is set up in the basis of what the formation that still endures today. This is the moment where the Privy Council, a major organ of Scottish government, likewise becomes prominent. And Mary inherited both of these institutions. And these leave us fantastic sources. But the poetry I mentioned is another really wonderful source as well. And so we get a fantastic insight into the court of James V. If you hear any noises in the background this evening, that's probably my dog playing with her ball and trying to get a bit of attention. And you know what? If you hear that, please give me some sympathy, but also think, oh, it's just like being in the court of James V, because we know from the poetry of James's court that he was a little bit of a canine fan as well. And there's a poem written in the voice of one of his dogs, Bagshee, the king's old dog, giving advice to younger, newer dogs. And this describes some of the naughty behaviour the dogs got up to at court, including jumping on the king's bed, even when the bedspread had a cloth, even when it was spread with cloth of gold. The cloth literally spun from very thin gold threads. We've also got a poem describing James's pet parrot that could talk and delighted everybody with the words it had learned. So James was an ambitious monarch, an assertive monarch, somebody with really a clear sense of law, of majesty, of royal authority, of a desire to expand royal power, but also someone very much aware of, I suppose, what we might describe as soft power, right? The cultural, the importance of the word in the ear, the importance of artistic patronage. And tonight, having briefly introduced James V, who I hope I've convinced you already, is wrongly less prominent in Scottish and international consciousness than his daughter, I want to explore some of the similarities between father and daughter. They're both working as members of administratively ambitious regimes. They've got teams of advisors. They're really good at selecting people to bring around them. And you'll already have seen in my mention of James's court literature, his poetry, his pageantry, the direct line of ancestry for the festival that we started this lecture with, Mary's baptism for her son, which likewise produced poetry and other artistic responses. So, I could give you a 12-week series of lectures with barely any breaks, pointing out all of the similarities between father and daughter. But tonight I want to focus in on 3 of them. The first one is the law, James's attitude to the law and how this might have influenced some of what his daughter did. The second section is how they use royal lieutenants, how they delegate royal authority, and we might also call this section how you manage a problem half-brother. And finally, having started with Mary and the English succession, we're going to reframe that problem and say, actually, do you know what? Mary's not the first Stuart to have a close relationship with the House of Tudor down south. How did her father manage this? Is this new for Mary in the 1560s, or actually is this just a new manifestation of the same old problem? And I hope at the end I'm going to have convinced you not only of the similarities between father and daughter and how worthwhile it is to think about Mary as someone who is heir to this tradition, but of the vibrancy of government in Scotland in the 16th century and the sophistication of the Scottish court. Now, I'm aware I've started off with a pretty heavy topic, and you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, I wish I'd gone in the garden for that cool glass of something instead of coming to this. But in a moment I said, we're going to think about the law. So to lighten that up, let's start with a little game of spot the difference. Now, on the left, we've got James V's printed Acts of Parliament. And the link I put on there is to a blog on the other thing you can see on this screen, which is Mary's Acts of Parliament. And that's by one of my fantastic PhD students, Kate McGregor. So let's look at the similarities between these. We've got the same royal arms. We have got exactly the same layout. We have the same motto. The only real difference in the main design of these is the name. Jacobus Rex, King James, Maria Regina, Queen Mary. And that is because when Mary came to publish her Acts of Parliament, she reused the woodcut that had been on the front of her father's as a deliberate statement of continuity. This is deliberately working within a tradition. It was quite a short tradition because this printed Act of Parliament, the one you can see on the left of the screen, James's Acts of Parliament, was the first printed Acts of Parliament to be produced in Scotland. There'd been plans to do this since the arrival of the printing press earlier in the 16th century in the reign of James IV, but James V was the monarch who actually managed to get a team headed by the Clerk Register, the royal official in charge of the Royal Archives and the organisation of the Royal Administration, to really arrange for the publication of the Acts of Parliament. It was intended to improve access to the law. Although parliamentary acts had previously been made available through manuscripts, handwritten texts, and oral proclamation, having them printed meant that the Crown could really control to a far greater degree the quality of the text. They could make sure that everybody was reading exactly the same thing. This would improve the administration of the law. It would make the Crown's authority stronger throughout the country. Sadly, only 3 copies of James's Acts of Parliament survive, and nobody sort of commented on having received it. But we do know a little bit about them, and we do know it worked. You can see at the top of this copy of it, and this is one from the National Library, the names, this is basically ex libris Robert Danielson, and this is the man who is associated with the Chapel Royal and the royal administration more broadly. But we've got accounts showing that this was purchased by many of James's administrators. So, 1542, excited sheriffs, lawyers, town councillors up and down the land are clutching their new books, the Acts and Constitutions of Parliament. In 1556-57, as we move over to the right-hand side of the slide, exactly the same constituency are clutching another new book, the Acts and Constitutions of Parliament, produced by Queen Mary. Now, the big difference here is that James's Acts of Parliament had only focused on his recent parliaments, but Mary, building on her father's project, was more ambitious, and she included all of the acts of her predecessors up to James I onwards. So this is over 100 years of parliamentary legislation. But if reusing her father's title piece wasn't enough, when we open Mary's book, we can see the clear influence of what her father was up to. So Mary's Acts of Parliament reprinted James V's Acts of Parliament, and this is the final page of that. The layout here is noticeable. This exactly mimics the layout of James's Acts of Parliament. And the little telltale signs here include this little poem down on the left page at the very bottom. You've got this brief Latin verse written by James Fowles, the Clerk Register, whose name you can also see on there, who was the man responsible for producing these. These little poems appear at the end of each monarch's Acts of Parliament. The book is punctuated with them. And in reusing these, we can see that Mary's administrators are exactly following in James V's footsteps. There are other telltale signs throughout this book as well. Copies of the signatures of Mary's administrators are made and are inserted at comparable points in the books to those where her father's administrators' signatures had been. So we're really seeing here not only an interest in the subject matter that we don't often associate with Mary, an interest in improving the quality of written law available to her subjects, but we're seeing an awareness amongst the Queen and those she tasked with doing this of the tradition in which they were participating, a tradition started by her father. Now, I've been talking a little bit about the team that Mary got together to think about this, and we're going to come to that in a minute. But just before we do, Tessa said I was going to show you some of the treasures of the National Records of Scotland. So this next slide is an image from James V's manuscript Parliamentary Records. So these are the notes that were taken in preparation. This is the draft copy of the Acts of Parliament that were produced for James. It's extremely exciting because we can see all the editing process. If you look in the margin, you can see the additions that are being added in for this. And I think when we look at this, we can also think, gosh, thank goodness they got the printed copy, because that's much, much easier to read. Okay, we said a moment ago there's a team behind this. This is a big publication project. It's one that a lot of people are working on. And the person who Mary, one of the people involved in Mary's project, an important person, was her half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Murray. Mary created him Earl of Murray in 1562. Now, this brings us on to the second way in which I think Mary was really following in her father's footsteps in how she was ruling. Now, those of you familiar with the tragic, romantic public story of Mary will have encountered Murray as sort of the villain to her victim, or alternatively the hero to her villain, depending on which way you cut things. But the Earl of Murray, Mary's illegitimate half-brother, although he had a key role in her deposition and became regent following her deposition on behalf of her young son, James VI, before this, we need to remember he was a loyal member of Mary's regime. When Mary had military campaigns within the country, for example, putting down the rebellion of 1562, she appointed her half-brother as her royal lieutenant to serve on her behalf, and that wasn't the only occasion on which she did this. So Murray, Mary's half-brother, was the representation of her royal authority when she was unable to go and participate in military campaigns herself. But this isn't the first time that a royal half-brother had been used in this way. A traditional interpretation of what Mary did when she asked her half-brother to go off was this was because of her gender. A woman couldn't serve in a military capacity herself. And indeed, that's true. But how can we explain then that 30 years earlier, in the 1530s, James V was asking his half-brother, also called James Stuart. I mean, these people, it's astounding, really. They rule over fantastic Renaissance courts, but they can't think of any names other than James Stuart or Mary Stuart. So James Stuart, James V, commissioned his half-brother, also James Stuart, to act as his lieutenant, to serve on his behalf in, for example, the 1532-3 war with England, where the Earl of Murray, a title that James V bestowed on James Stuart, his half-brother. I told you it would get confusing. The first Earl of Murray and James V were working in exactly the same way as a team, with the half-brother, the illegitimate half-brother, serving as a lieutenant, serving as this representation of royal authority. And we see mirrors in this relationship between father and daughter and their illegitimate half-brothers in lots of different ways. We see it in terms of the role that the illegitimate half-brothers are given in the Privy Council. They are raised up, they are close to the monarch, they are advising the monarch in a really important way. We see it in the patronage that they receive in return of lands, notably the Earldom of Murray, but also jewels and other gifts. So what we see then when we look at father and daughter is not only a similar approach to the management of law, but a similar approach to how you do the practicalities of governing. When Mary and the Earl of Murray, her half-brother, were riding together and thinking about the state of the country in the 1560s, for anybody who had been familiar with their father, the scene would have looked entirely similar. They would have been recalling their father and their uncle riding and discussing the state of the country together. And the earldom of Murray here is, I think, particularly important. Obviously, this is in the north of Scotland. It's away from the area where the Crown has most of its lands. So it's a real sense in which a peripheral member of the family was being brought in to help establish establish Crown power in a broader area. Now, we're getting on to the final thing that I want to talk about in terms of the similarities. I've talked so far about two similarities in approach. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a similar, I think it's one of these situations that is both a problem and an opportunity that faced James V and then his daughter. Mary, of course, inherited her claim to the English throne. The reason that Queen Elizabeth, who we met in the opening slides, was so worried about Mary having an heir, and in some ways the reason that Mary ended up with her head on the block in 1587. Mary inherited this problematic claim to the English succession, of course, from her father. There's going to be times for questions later, but if there aren't, then I will do a small quiz for you all on this slide, which is James V and the English succession. Now, joking aside, I'm not really going to ask you all to remember this, but what I want, and I can see there's a lot of information here, but what I want to show to you is just how close James was to coming to the English throne throughout his life from the moment of his birth. He was never more than third away from the English throne. So when we think about the relationship between the monarchs of Scotland and the monarchs of England in the 16th century, this theme about succeeding to the English throne is absolutely constant. That marriage of James IV and Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VII, really bequeathed a complicated legacy for their eldest, James V. And as with Mary in the 1560s and Elizabeth, so with James and with Henry, the fathers of these two women. Like Elizabeth, Henry VIII was well aware that his northern neighbour could now easily be his successor. And like Elizabeth, Henry sought to turn this to his advantage. He offered his eldest daughter, Mary Tudor, who would later be known as Bloody Mary, as a potential bride to James as part of a package which said he would henceforth be called Prince of Wales and would be given an official place in the English succession. Now, history didn't turn out like that. James V had a French bride, and Henry VIII, rather than deciding that he would marry his eldest daughter to another monarch and secure the English succession that way, decided to divorce his first wife, behead the second, and you all know, I'm sure, the rest of the rhyme. But Henry's moving around with the succession, his wife swapping, his changes of religion, this meant that there was live ammunition provided in his relationship with the King of Scots. And certainly before the birth of his son, Edward, in 1536, this was something that Henry used to try and get James to do what he wanted, i.e., align with England and abandon the alliance with France. So this is exactly the same dynamic that we see between Mary and Elizabeth in the 1560s, with Elizabeth trying to hold out the carrot of acknowledgement in the English succession in order to make Mary do what she wanted. So how did James respond? Well, in quite variable ways. At times, he said he was interested in what Henry VIII was offering, and he sort of played things along a little bit. Obviously, he wasn't that interested because the match with Mary Tudor never came off. He also tread a careful line to avoid antagonising his uncle. In 1540, my colleague Alison Cathcart has shown a group of Irish nobles were so discontented with Henry VIII that they offered James V to be King of Ireland instead of Henry because they thought he would be a better monarch. Religion was clearly an element in this. Those Irish lords, like James, were strong in the Catholic faith, and at that time, Henry VIII had converted to Protestantism. And this religious difference between uncle and nephew gave James V a huge amount of power. And we see this in the last quotation that we're going to look at together tonight. Now, for any of you who've watched Wolf Hall or read it, you will of course know the character of Ralph Sadler, one of the English officials who works for Thomas Cromwell. Well, Sadler's second career was as ambassador to Scotland, and he was constantly back and forth, up and down between Henry VIII and James V. And indeed, that would continue after James's death. And one letter that describes one of Sadler's embassies is really interesting, and that's what we've got on this slide. This is a letter from the English Privy Council complaining to the Scottish Privy Council that when Sadler arrived in Scotland, there were conveyed hither from Scotland sundry little books printed. So lots of little books have been printed in Scotland. Amongst all of them, there was one entitled The Trumpet of Honour. And on the first page of the book, the King, your master, so James V, taketh upon him a piece of the title of the King's Majesty. So that's Henry VIII. So James V is using one of Henry VIII's titles. Because James V, the English Council explains, is described defender of the Christian faith. Famously, before he converted to Protestantism, Henry VIII had been entitled defender of the Christian faith. And this is really bothersome. The English Council say it is the more pricking because he, James V, added to the Christian faith, added to the title, the defender of the faith, the Christian faith, as though there should be any other faith. So implying that Henry is not the protector of the Christian faith anymore. He's no longer a Christian. So here we've got James, or someone close to James, taking one of Henry VIII's titles in order to provoke him, in order to show diplomatic strength. And this was exactly the strategy that Mary herself had used in 1558, when Elizabeth first became Queen of England. From the perspective of Catholic Europe, Elizabeth's father's marriage to her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been illegitimate. And Mary, therefore, when she heard of this, had herself proclaimed in France as Queen of England. And she even got the English ambassador there to eat of a new dinner service she'd had commissioned, which showed her arms, the arms of Scotland and France, quartered with those of England. I'm going to have to leave you there because I'm aware that Tessa said 30 to 40 minutes, and she said that knowing that I could go on for much longer about this topic. But before I conclude rather, let's just draw things together a little bit. I hope tonight I've introduced you to the richness of the Scottish court of the 1530s and also some of the fantastic sources we have for the study of it. I also I hope that I've shown you some of the ways in which government worked, and that this ranged from informal things like this book here, The Trumpet of Honour, to poems, so the articulation about ideas of government, or image management, we might call it, through to things like the law and how you manage relationships with different members of your royal family, and how that can be used in order to assert power in the localities. I hope throughout this I've shown you some of the similarities between Mary and not her cousin down in England, although that was, as we've seen, a really important relationship, but Mary and the Scottish precedents. And that with that, I've given a sense that although this famous lady, who, as we see on the final slide, was a Queen of France and appeared as such in the Jardin de Luxembourg as part of the series of statues of Queen of France, she was also, in contrary to what her critics said, very much a Queen of Scots. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
We will now stop the recording.